I was at a chasna in Kiryat Sefer, Modi'in Illit, and for some reason there is a massive traffic jam around Ramot. I don't know exactly why, but it took a very, very long time to get here. But Baruch Hashem, we're relatively on time. So today we're going to talk about the most mysterious mitzvah in the Torah, the one that Chazal identify as very much of an enigma, and that is the Para Aduma, the red heifer. And the red heifer is a particularized ritual that is employed to purify people who have become ritually impure by contact with dead bodies. It does not apply to other tumas. There are all sorts of reasons why people become tameh. A nida has a certain status of tuma, a mitzora, but para aduma is not relevant for those categories. Para aduma, however, is the exclusive method that is necessary for people that are tamei met. Now, all of us are considered to be tamei met today. If you have ever been in a cemetery, you are tamei met, and more or less life can go on. A tamei met goes to shul, a tamei met puts on tefillin, keeps Shabbos, keeps kashrus. So tamei is not an exclusion from Klal Yisrael, of course, but it does mean that you can't enter the Beit HaMikdash. If you're a Kohen, you couldn't do the divine service. You can't eat truma. And the only possible way to get out of Tumat Met is to be sprinkled with the ashes of the Para Aduma mixed with water on day 3 and on day 7 of your 7-day Tuma period, and then go to the mikvah on day 7, and then you become Tahor at night. Therefore, that is why, since although we do have mikvah, we do not have the ritual of Heifer Para Bisman Hazeh. That is why we are all tamei met, and that is essentially the halachic reason why many people, most Gedolim, rule that we are not allowed to enter the Temple Mount. And I just want to emphasize, without getting into too many technical details, that even the poskim who permit entry on the Temple Mount only permit entry on an outer perimeter of the Temple Mount, on the grounds that that doesn't have the halachic status of the temple. But in principle, there is no machloket. Any area that has the halachic status of the Beit HaMikdash, a tamei met cannot enter. There is no machloket about that whatsoever. The only question is, how confident are we to be willing to identify what is inner and what is outer? The standard psak halacha to be strict, which is the Rabbanut's psak, as well as the Haredi world's psak, is we don't want to take any chances, so we don't go on any part of it. Within the Dati Leumi world, there's a little bit more liberality or courage, however you want to define it, to be willing to define what is Beit HaMikdash, what is not. But again, it is important to emphasize that this is not a machlokes in halachic principle. It is simply a machlokes in how certain and confident are you to make your identification. By the way, the old adage, politics make strange bedfellows, is very, very interesting here, because the government's position is the same as ultra-Haredi position. We don't want people to go on any part of the Temple Mount. So it's interesting. Now, granted, the government's reasons are not at all the same as the Haredi world's reasons, but they do share a common denominator. Now, it is a very strange thing. I mean, I don't want to talk about it too much, because I want to talk about some other aspects of it. That on one hand, I myself follow the strict psak halacha. I would not go on the Temple Mount based on the psak that we're not sure what part of it is temple, what part of it is not. On the other hand, it does fill me with a great deal of chagrin that people who do go on the Temple Mount, Israeli law does not allow them officially to daven, to recite prayers, to recite a bracha. If you were to take your water bottle on the Temple Mount and make a shahakol, and the police saw you make a shahakol, you would be arrested. You would be taken forcibly off the Temple Mount for practicing Jewish religious rituals. So it really is quite amazing and quite upsetting that in a Jewish state, a Jewish police force will not allow a Jewish person to practice Jewish law on the site of the Jewish temple. But that is the way it is, because the fear of rioting and the fear of Arab violence and provocation, which needs very little provocation anyway, is so great that they consider this to literally be a gasoline tank, and opening up a siddur is like throwing a match into gasoline, and the police are actually very, very vigilant. In fact, people who want to daven, they do so by hiding their siddur in a newspaper or whatever it is. And in fact, there even was, I think last year, and again, people question whether it should have been done, a surreptitious chasana. So how do you make a chasana on the Temple Mount? Basically, you're just walking. The chatan is walking with the kala, and he has together with two other men who are the designated witnesses, and he simply, hands her a ring as he mumbles the words, Hareyat Mekudeshesli, and somebody took a photo with a cell phone, and that was their wedding picture, so to speak, of him handing her a ring while they are walking. Again, some question that because of the provocation it might cause after the fact, but okay. Nevertheless, as I say, it's a strange situation for me to be in, because I personally halachically follow the rule that Jewish people should not go on the Temple Mount. On the other hand, once they're going, they certainly should have the right to do mitzvot in a holy place. Yeah.
But if the whole generation is tamei, doesn't that supersede us not going up?
No, that actually is not true. What it does mean is the following: if the whole generation is tamei met, they are permitted to go for certain purposes, namely the Korban Pesach and the like. So there may be limited permissibility to go, but that is absolutely not a carte blanche to go other than the Korban Pesach, perhaps, which raises a myriad.
We could offer the Korban Pesach.
Well, if Tumah would be the only problem, yes, but there are numerous other problems. For example, we don't know where the Mizbeach is, and like. But you are correct. People, serious halachic thinkers, discuss the possibility of bringing a Korban Pesach. It is not a frivolous question. It is a serious question. But as I say, there are many, many other problems other than Tumah. Tumah, with respect to Korban Pesach, would in fact, you are correct, would not be a problem per se. But that does not justify entry, indiscriminate entry. Now, let me just mention one thing. Again, I don't want to get into too many halachot. The predicate that you're not allowed to enter the Temple Mount, even when there's no temple, is based on a ruling of the Rambam, who says the Temple Mount has eternal sanctity. There is, in fact, an alternative opinion of the Ravid, Rav Avram ben David, the one who always argues with the Rambam, who actually says the Temple Mount does not have any sanctity when there is no Beit HaMikdash on it. And according to the Ravid, therefore, a person who is Tameh would be permitted indiscriminate entry on the Temple Mount without mikvah, without anything, because the Ravid maintains that the Temple Mount, in the absence of a temple, is no more holier than any other part of Jerusalem. So according to the Ravid, it is legamri mutar. Obviously, there is no posek in the world today that is following the Ravid, lahalacha lamasa, but according to the Ravid, you could even go where the Kodesh HaKadoshim is. There would be no halachic problem with that. Now, interestingly enough, around 150 years, 170 years ago or so, on one of Sir Moses Montefiore's trips to the Holy Land, the great British Orthodox philanthropist who was really so responsible for all the shechunot in Yerushalayim. In fact, that's why the word Moshe appears in so many neighborhoods, whether it's Yamin Moshe, whether it's Kiryat Moshe, Maskeret Moshe. There are a number of shechunot that have the word, the name Moshe in it. They are named not after Moshe Rabbeinu, they are named after Moses Montefiore. And on one of his trips, one of the maskilim, one of the enlightened ones, convinced him to go on the Temple Mount, saying that, he just showed him the Ravid. The Ravid says it's okay. So Moses Montefiore actually took a trip on the Temple Mount, and that caused a riot, not on the part of the Arabs, that caused a riot on the part of the old Yishuv of Yerushalayim, who wanted to basically terminate any connection with him, which would have been financially catastrophic because he was virtually the 100% pipeline for the yeshuvim outside of the old city walls. Eventually, they decided they could still work with him. It would have been catastrophic not to. And he did issue a public apology, stating that he was misled and he certainly did not intend to break the halacha, but somebody told him the Ravid, and he was not aware of this machlokas, the Rambam and the Ravid.
Did we consider the strict opinion by going in a certain type of a carriage?
I'll check the story. The way the story that I saw was, maybe this was another time he went.
They carried him in a box.
Okay, I have to see because the story that I saw was that he just followed the Ravid Shita. So maybe these were two different times he did it. But I'll check. I'll try to verify which way that went. Yeah.
Another timely question. We all read that recently the path of Aliyat Regel has been discovered and will soon be available to visitors, to tourists. Does that mean that as a visitor I can follow the path of the Aliyat Regel all the way up to the Temple Mount, and then I have to stop and turn around and come back? That's
correct, because the Aliyat Regel at the time of the temple, you were tahor, right? I mean, Chayav Adam l'taher atzmo b'regel. So you obviously could not take the Ola Regel path that enters the Temple Mount, or at least the inner part of the Temple Mount, because people who took that path, by definition, purified themselves before the Chag. That was an obligation. That you had to become tahor for each one of the shalosh regalim. Okay, so that's kind of the general perspective of para aduma. Let me just also emphasize the fact that every once in a while, every few years, we hear about a para aduma being born somewhere. By the way, para aduma, for many years, when I was a kid, I used to think para aduma was like a fire engine red, which of course there is no such thing in nature. So I thought, well, that's why para aduma is so rare and miraculous. But not really. It's not fire engine red. It's a very common color for cattle. It is simply the brownish orange color, which many, many cows have. The chiddush of para aduma is it has to be 100%. You can only have one black hair, so that's going to be uncommon. But typically the all brownish orange cow would qualify as a para aduma, and those are the pictures. When they show you a para aduma was born, they're showing you those pictures, and people get also all excited about it. But you have to know that even having a para aduma is only the beginning of the process, because you have a very severe catch-22. Because in order to prepare a para aduma, you have to have kohanim that are already tahor. So how do they become tahor? So in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, what it was there was always a remnant from a prior para aduma that would be set aside to purify the kohanim, who would then be in a position to make a new para aduma. But unless you have a remnant of pre-existing ashes, there is no way you can make a new para aduma, because the kohanim who would have to prepare it are not in a state of purity. So what's going to happen is, so how will we get out of that catch-22? That when Eliyahu Hanavi announces Mashiach, he's going to bring with him some spare ashes, enough to be mitaher a few kohanim, and they will then proceed to prepare a para aduma that could be utilized for all of the Jewish people. So people shouldn't be overconfident. The discovery of a para aduma in and of itself does not give us the mechanism to purify. Huh? This was saved. There is a tradition that even when the temple was destroyed, a certain cachet of ashes was preserved, was saved, and that will be brought back before the temple is built in order to make a para aduma to purify. In other words, that remnant will purify a few people, and then they'll make a new para aduma, maybe more than one, to purify everybody else. Yeah.
Can't you keep diluting it down with spring water?
Yes, you can. As a matter of fact, because you'd wonder, how could one para aduma even suffice for a whole Jewish population? You keep on diluting it. Yeah, but you have to have some ashes, right? You can't just do the spring water. Spring water itself is not going to help. Okay. Now, if we go back to the beginning of the parsha, when the Torah introduces para aduma, it uses an unusual phrase: Zot chukat haTorah. This is the chok of the Torah. Now, chok we have a pretty good definition for. Chok is the term that the Torah uses for mitzvos that we don't understand the reason. Mishpatim are the mitzvos that are logical, that are sensible. Chukim are the mitzvos that we don't understand. And paraduma, for the reasons I'll discuss, is the paradigmatic mitzvah that we don't understand. It is called a chok. But the Mefarshim focus on a different problem. Why does it say this is the chok of the Torah? It should just say this is the chok of the para. This is the inexplicable law of the para. Why does it say this is the chok of the Torah? So I'll give you two answers. One is based on the Vilna Gaon, and the other is based on a shmuz, a sicha of Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, the legendary great Rosh Hashiva of Mir. The Vilna Gaon in Mishlei has a remarkable comment. Everybody knows the idea that Torah is compared to water. That's a famous statement of Chazal. Torah is compared to water. And there are a gazillion reasons why Torah is compared to water. It's life-sustaining, it's purifying, it cleanses the soul. Just as water goes from high ground to low ground, so the Torah leaves the arrogant and goes to the humble. Many, many reasons why Torah is compared to water. But the Vilna Gaon gives another reason, which is quite unusual. It really can blow your mind in many ways. He says the koach of water is that water facilitates growth on whatever plant you pour it on. So if I pour water on wheat or flowers, I will get the wheat or flowers. If I pour water on poisonous weeds, the water will cause the poisonous weeds to grow. In other words, water is a medium that causes growth regardless of whether that growth is positive or negative. So here's what the Vilna Gaon says. Torah is compared to water because whatever personality characteristics you already possess, the Torah will accentuate, enlarge, and expand. So, if you are a compassionate, kind, considerate person, the Torah will make you more so. Okay, that itself is unexceptionable. But the second part of it is truly amazing. If a person is filled with arrogance and gaiva, not only will the Torah not improve him, the Torah is like water. It may make him worse. Torah will accentuate and exaggerate whatever parts of your personality are there. If you are competitive, your learning of Torah will simply give you another avenue of self-aggrandizement and one-upmanship. Now, this is an extraordinary statement. Number one, the Vilna Gaon was not a slouch when it came to Torah learning. I mean, if a Hasidic Rebbe might have said something like this, all right, I could maybe see it, although that was an unfair statement in and of itself. But the Vilna Gaon, who devoted 22 hours of every day towards the learning of Torah, the Vilna Gaon who would literally count the minutes per year that he felt was Bittul Torah, and by the way, whatever he felt was Bittul Torah was probably not even Bittul Torah as far as we're concerned, but his definition of Bittul Torah was measured in minutes. The Vilna Gaon said, without consciously working to improve your character, the Torah is not going to do it automatically. The Torah can even make you worse. Torah is compared to water. That's why the Vilna Gaon, in an indirect way, is actually considered to be the founder of the Musar movement of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. In fact, there is a direct link, because the Vilna Gaon's primary disciple was Rav Chaim of Volozhin, and Rav Chaim of Volozhin had many, many students, but one of his great students was a man, Rav Zundel of Salant, and Rav Zundel of Salant was the spiritual mentor of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. And many actually say that the Vilna Gaon was one who taught the primacy of midot, tovot, that it's not automatic, and indeed maybe it's no accident that the very first sefer of the Vilna Gaon that was published after his death were not his commentaries on Gemara or Shulchan Aruch, but his commentary on the book of Mishlei, the book of Proverbs, which is about ethics and midos. Now, this itself is a vast question, because there are those that take the opposite view, including some students of the Vilna Gaon, that Torah itself makes you a better person. The learning of Torah automatically will make you a better person. I will leave it to your own empirical observations which side of this machlokas is going to be true. I don't want to take sides on it directly. And even within the writings of the Vilna Gaon, there are some contradictions. There are many places where the Vilna Gaon talks about the purifying power of Limud HaTorah, but at least in this startling passage, that Torah is compared to water, he makes the assertion, which, it's funny, I occasionally said this thought in Or Sameach, but one time there were people from Lakewood, and they said, it's impossible, it couldn't be true. So I don't say it there anymore, because I don't feel like getting into fights with people, but it is indeed a statement of the Vilna Gaon. Yeah.
But there is this concept that I'm sure the Vilna Gaon did accept, and that is better to learn not the Shema, and then eventually maybe you'll become the Shema.
Yes, that is correct. It is important that the Vilna Gaon is not suggesting that if you have bad midot, don't learn Torah. Obviously, you learn Torah anyway because you have to do that, as you said, but the Vilna Gaon is cautioning us that the midot do not take care of themselves. You have to consciously strive to purify your midot. And that's work. And in fact, the famous statement of Yisrael Salanter, it is harder to change one bad midah than it is to learn the entire Talmud. And
the Vilna Gaon?
No, the Vilna Gaon did not. This is Rabbi Salanter said. Yes, so this is a very, very famous mimer that Rabbi Salanter said. And as they say, it really comes indirectly, at least, from the Vilna Gaon, the idea of midot, tovot, and the like, something that we have to all pay very, very careful attention to. Now, so let me connect it now to Parah Adumah. So based on this teaching of the Vilna Gaon, I would suggest the following. What is the chok? What is the enigma of Parah Adumah? In other words, okay, the whole thing is strange, but there are many things that are strange. Why is Parah Adumah more of a chok than shatnez, wool and linen, or many things that we don't have, meat and milk, we don't have concrete explanations for? So the Mefarshim all explain that the enigma of Parah Adumah is not simply that it's a strange ritual, but it's a paradox and a self-contradiction. Because the rule of Parah Adumah is that the ashes, when they are sprinkled on the impure person, make him pure. And yet all the pure people that handle those ashes, they become impure. Now, it doesn't mean, but people ask the question, so doesn't that create an infinite cycle that nobody can ever be pure? Because I'm tameh, I'm sprinkled, I become tahor, you become tameh. You then got to be sprinkled, so somebody else becomes tameh. So doesn't that mean that the last guy holding the bag is going to be tameh? No. And the reason why that's not so is that the tumah that you get by handling Parah Adumah ashes is not a tumah that requires being sprinkled with the ashes of Parah Adumah. And therefore all you have to do is go to the mikveh, meaning I sprinkle you, I'm tameh, I go to the mikveh, I'm tahor, everybody's happy. So it's not an infinite regression type of problem. But the chok is said to be paradox. How can the same thing that purifies be a vehicle of tumah? But the answer is, zos chukat haTorah, that enigma is in the Torah itself. As the Vilna Gaon says, Torah is compared to water. It can improve that which is good, and it can make worse that which is not good. In other words, the paradox, how one thing can make you, how the same thing can make you pure and make you impure, is chukat haTorah, is built into the Torah. By the way, my Rosh Hashiva, Rav Ruderman, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, is a bit of a sharp word. He once described NCSY that way. You know, the perennial problem in the States, I'm sure all of you are familiar, or most of you are familiar with the wonderful, wonderful youth organization of the OU, the Orthodox Union, mainly in the United States, although they're trying to do stuff in Israel as well. NCSY, National Conference of Synagogue Youth, that has made generations of public school kids religious, and many of them are even B'nai Torah, learning in yeshivos and the like, and they've done amazing, fantastic work. But these are co-educational events, and initially, when a lot of the kids are not religious at all, they come dressed in all sorts of different ways. So a perennial issue that yeshivos grapple with is that NCSY would like yeshiva students to serve as the teachers and the advisors in the Shabbatot. I mean, that's what they do. You want to get people that are knowledgeable and religious. But many of the yeshivas don't like their students to go to NCSY because it's co-ed and the like. So I remember my yeshiva once said that when somebody argued to him that NCSY does such phenomenally great work that you have to let your students participate. So he said to him, NCSY is like the para aduma. Meaning to say, if you're coming from a state of impurity, you're not religious, you're not keeping the commandments, NCSY purifies you. If, on the other hand, you're coming from a religious state, NCSY might drag you down. So he was a little reluctant to say different Rosh Yeshivas did it different ways. His position was that once you were married and you came with your wife, then it was very good to be a participant in NCSY. He didn't like single yeshiva guys going. Okay, again, I'm not here to paskin on that shaila either, but I thought the reference to Para Aduma was a humorous description. Okay, so that's first pshat. Zos chukat Torah, meaning to say the same paradox that it could purify and contaminate that exists by para applies to the Torah as a whole. Explanation number 2 is from Chaim Shmulev. So Chaim Shmulev, it says that the reason why it says chukas haTorah is the way you keep the chok shows what your attitude is to the whole Torah. Because a chok is a mitzvah that by definition makes no rational sense. It doesn't fit. So if I do it, I'm only doing it because it's God's will. When I keep mishpatim, not stealing, not murdering, we don't have a proof that I'm doing it because it's God's will. Maybe I'm doing it because it makes sense to me. So chukat haTorah means the way you relate to a chok shows us, or shows God, the way you relate to the Torah as a whole. You are doing the will of God, and you're doing it as an act of submission, not as an act of logic, not because it makes sense to you. You are doing it as obedience to the higher authority. And Chaim Shmulev says there's a special Yetzer Hara that rebels against the chok, because the one thing a human being doesn't like to do is to kind of take orders. We like to do things because we've decided to do them, not because somebody's commanding us. The example would be the good husband who is about to take out the garbage on his own, wasn't even asked. And as he takes the garbage in the kitchen, his wife calls from the other room, could you take out the garbage? There will be, I don't want to be too autobiographical here, there will be a moment of tension in the husband that says, I don't like to be told what to do. When you're doing it anyway, you're a tzaddik. That actually explains an interesting passage in the Gemara. There's a famous Gemara that says that if a person does a mitzvah they're commanded to do, they get greater reward than a person who does a mitzvah that they're not commanded to do. So a good example would be, let's take sukkah. Men are obligated to eat in the sukkah. Women are not obligated. A woman does not have to eat in the sukkah because it is a time-bound positive commandment, and it's not one of the exceptions. If a woman on her own wants to eat in the sukkah, she does have a mitzvah, she gets rewarded, and at least if you're Ashkenazic, you could even make a bracha. A woman can even make a bracha leishe basukah. So a woman very definitely gets a mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah, and the same thing with lulav and etrog, and the same thing with hearing shofar. But the man gets more reward for that mitzvah because the man is commanded to do it. The woman is not commanded. Woman gets reward for other mitzvahs. Now, people ask the question, well, I thought the logic goes the other way. There's time and a half for overtime. Meaning to say, if I do something I don't have to do, God should give me extra credit. If I did it because I have to do it, all right, good. so I get rewarded. But if I go beyond the law, shouldn't that deserve more reward? And yet the Gemara says that he or she who does a commandment that they're not commanded to do, get reward. They do get reward, but it's not the same. So Tosfos says a fascinating psychological thought. When you do a mitzvah you're commanded to do, it's actually harder. Because once you're commanded, your Yetzer Hara becomes more rebellious. When you do things on an optional basis, you're kind of patting yourself on the back. This was my decision. When you're doing it because you have to do it, I don't like to be told what to do. And therefore the chok is the exemplar of doing something because you have to do it, not because you want to do it, and not because it makes sense to you. And Reb Chaim Shmulevitz gives a marvelous analogy from Tanakh about as soon as we're told to do something, then b'dafka we don't want to do it. And the example he gives is of the story of a man, Shimi ben Gera. Shimi ben Gera was a man who was part of Shaul's family, and when David HaMelech was running away from his own son Avshalom, who wanted to both depose him and kill him, so Shimi ben Gera cursed David and said, "You're getting what you deserve because you usurped the monarchy from Shaul HaMelech, and now God is punishing you." And if you remember, David's faithful general and nephew, Yoav was very quick. I was going to say quick with the trigger, but there were no guns, but quick with the sword. Yoav said, "Should I just finish this guy off?" And David HaMelech uttered words of great, great patience and forbearance. He said, "If God did not want me to be cursed, this wouldn't have happened. If this came from God, I accept it. I will not punish the wrongdoer or the person who did it to me." What's interesting is, it's very peculiar, that was a wonderful behavior of forgiveness and forbearance. But on David's deathbed, he took a very, very different stance. He told his son Shlomo that this guy, kind of like the Godfather, this guy Shimi ben Gera, take care of him. Be sure that you find some excuse to put him to death. Now one could discuss a whole question. I mean, what happened to David's attitude that Shimi ben Gera was acting as an emissary of God? We'll leave that to the side. That's a fascinating question. But what did Shlomo HaMelech do? Shlomo HaMelech told Shimi ben Gera, "I'm not going to kill you because my father forgave you at the time, but I'm putting you under city arrest. Not even house arrest, city arrest. Do not leave Yerushalayim. And the day that you leave Yerushalayim, your life is going to be forfeited." That's all he told him. Don't leave Yerushalayim. Now that doesn't seem to be that difficult, especially if you're told if you leave Yerushalayim, you're going to get killed. And then we have a story that Shimon ben Gera lost his donkey. Some donkeys wandered off. And he decided to go look for them, thinking that they would, Shlomo wouldn't know. And of course Shlomo has guards all over the place watching him. And Shimi ben Gera gets caught and gets executed because he left Yerushalayim. So Reb Chaim Shmulevitz said, what type of idiot would do that? It's not like he left Yerushalayim to go to his mother's funeral. One could understand some extenuating circumstance. Even if you're going to risk your life, it's so important to you. These were donkeys. He had servants. He had other people that could have done this. And he was told that if he leaves the city and they catch him, he's going to be executed. Says Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, what's going on here is the following. If he hadn't been told he can't leave, he might not have left. He might have told his servants, go find the donkeys. As soon as he is given an order, you can never leave this city again, remaining in the city becomes unbearable. It becomes suffocating. He can't wait another minute to get out. You can try this little experiment. As soon as you're told, right, dieting happens all the time. I'm never going to eat chocolate again. You will have an unbearable desire for chocolate. Once you make that decision, I'm never going to have it again. Because once you can't have something, that's when you must have something. Even if you didn't have to have it until you couldn't have it, as it were. So Mamela Rav Chaim Shmulevitz says, Zos chukat haTorah, the chok, which is pure obedience, is so much against my egotism that it really defines my relationship to the Torah as a whole. Here I'm going to say something, I hope it's not in bad taste, and I hope it doesn't offend anybody. Within the Reform movement, one of the positive developments that has happened is there's been a great increase in the number of Reform Jews who put on tefillin every day. Tefillin has become a much bigger, more widely practiced mitzvah in the Reform movement. That's the good news. The bad news is that the increase in tefillin wearers are almost 100% women. Now, what's the story about that? Women and tefillin itself is a very interesting phenomenon because what does halacha say about women wearing tefillin? It's a digression, but I think it's worthwhile to spend a few moments about this. From a strict legalistic standpoint, we ought to treat tefillin the same way we treat sukkah and lulav and esrog. Women are exempt from tefillin because it is a time-bound positive commandment, because we don't wear tefillin on Shabbos, and we also don't wear tefillin at night. But just because they're exempt, that alone is not a reason that would stop them. They would get the reward of someone who does a mitzvah that they're not commanded to do. After all, if a woman is exempt from the sukkah, but she can eat in the sukkah, and she gets reward for the mitzvah, and for Ashkenazim, she could even make the bracha leishe b'sukkah. And if a woman is exempt from lulav and esrog, and she takes a lulav and esrog and makes a bracha, if she's Ashkenazi, she gets reward. So the logical consistency of the halacha would be that tefillin should be very much the same thing. She's exempt from tefillin, but if she wants to put on tefillin, she may. Now, indeed, there were some Rishonim that took that position, and you may have heard the tradition, although people say it's not a true story, that Rashi, who had no sons, Rashi's daughters were very learned and righteous women, and they put on tefillin. Again, some say that that's not a true story, but the Gemara records Michal bat Shaul wore tefillin. But then there are two girsos in the Gemara. It's fascinating, and these girsos make all the difference in the world. One girsa is V'lo michu bo chachamim, and the chachamim did not protest her behavior, which may indicate approval, or at least let her do it. Another girsa takes out the word v'lo, umichu bo chachamim, the chachamim protested. So there you have it in the Gemara, two different girsas. Now, Lamaisa, the Ramah does say, not only is a woman exempt from tefillin, the Ramah paskins a woman is not allowed to wear tefillin, and there are different reasons for that. Nevertheless, at a minimum, it's exemption, even if you consider it to be permissible. I'm sorry, it's not obligatory. It's only optional. So the question would be, why would the inspiration to wear tefillin be greater among women than among men? Exactly based on this Tosos. Because men who have to wear, the Yetzer Hara tries to tell them not to do it. When you don't have to do something, so then the Yetzer Hara is less powerful. All right, so be it as it may, therefore, Rav Chaim Shmulevitz tells us that is Zos Chukat HaTorah, the chok, which is obedience, l'shem obedience, is your attitude for the entire Torah. Now, one final point here. Rashi brings in the name of Rav Moshe HaDarshan. We know very little about who Rav Moshe the Darshan was, other than Rashi, who quotes him in several places. But apparently he was a great preacher, because almost always the particular teachings that Rashi quotes from him are intricate and interesting. And Rav Moshe HaDarshan makes the assertion that although para aduma is described as a chok, it actually is a kapara, it is an atonement for the chet ha'egel, for the sin of the golden calf. And the analogy he gives is, if a baby comes to a place and messes up, either loses control of his bowel movement or just makes a mess, so mom has to clean up after the baby. So too, the para, the cow, is a kapara for the chait that was connected with the offspring of the cow, namely the calf. Tavo ha'em u'sechaper al bina. And Rav Moshe Darshan then shows in great detail how every step of the ritual is mechuvan keneged the chait ha'egel. It kind of undoes the aspect of the chait ha'egel. So here I want to explore conceptually why the para aduma would be a kapara for the chait ha'egel. And that is the following idea. Let's look once more at the central paradox of para aduma. That the ashes of the para purify the impure, but they contaminate the pure. Paradox. The paradox is indeed very, very difficult. Even Shlomo HaMelech said, I wanted to be wise, I wanted to understand the Torah. Once I got to para aduma, I was stuck. Nevertheless, in spite of the fact that this is considered to be the chok par excellence, the enigma, and the ultimate mystery, the Sfas Emes tries to offer a partial explanation. And part of this overlaps with what I spoke about a few weeks ago. Let's go back to the idea of Tuma. Tuma, impurity, came into the world because of arrogance, ego, and hubris. Because man was originally supposed to live forever, but the Nachash enticed Chava, and Chava enticed Adam to eat from the Eitz Hadas. And according to Rav Tzadok in the Sfas Emes, the enticement that the Nachash used was an appeal to their ego by telling them, the day that you eat from this fruit, you will be like God with the capacity to understand the true nature of good and evil. In other words, the Eitz Hadas, or the fruit of the Eitz Hadas, was marketed as a God pill. The ultimate ego trip, whatever that means. Take this food and you will be God. Now, in many ways, we are godlike. The Torah describes us as being B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of God. We have autonomy, we have free will, we have creativity, we have the capacity to create and the capacity to destroy. There are many, many things we can do that are analogous to God. But because of our arrogance, God created the ultimate chasm, the ultimate dividing line between man and his creator, and that is immortality. Death is the ultimate reminder that we are not divine, although we have divine characteristics. So death came into the world because of arrogance, egotism, and hubris. That brought death into the world. Consequently, how do we become symbolically liberated from the impurity of death? By our connection to ashes. Now, this is not explaining why it's a red heifer, etc., but the notion of ashes. Ashes as a symbol of humility, submission, obliteration of the ego. Death comes into the world because of arrogance. I become liberated from the impurity of death by connection to ashes. It is the process of self-obliteration of the ego that allows me to realize my deepest divine potential. That is why the Greek myth of the phoenix, which actually is echoed in a medrash of Chazal about the netz bird, so really it's from Chazal, but for some reason the Greek version is more familiar, of the bird rising from the ashes, is such a profound story. It's not that important whether there was such a creature or whether there wasn't, because even in the context of the Midrashim are there not always to teach you literal truth. Midrashim are there to teach you symbolic, spiritual truths. This is what the Maral tells us, and really it goes back to the Rambam and even Rav Hai Gaon. I'm saying this as an aside, but this is actually a very important aside, that the Rambam writes that people raise a false dichotomy. People say, are all Midrashim true or not? As if it's only a binary question, true or not true. The Rambam says that's a false equation. All Midrashim are true, but truth is not always defined as literal truth. There are symbolic truths. So the netz bird, or in the Greek version, the phoenix bird, which rises from the ashes, is symbolically an extremely important lesson. It is only by obliteration of our ego and our arrogance that we truly achieve self-realization. That our own arrogance, our own sense of self, can sometimes be the biggest inhibitor in realization of who we truly are. And that is why Para Aduma is a purification ritual that is connected to ashes. So now, let's take it further and see that this is a key to the paradox as well. It's not only a key to the purification aspect, it's also a key to the contamination aspect. Because if ashes are seen as a symbol of humility and self-abnegation and obliteration of the ego, that can be the greatest step towards spiritual advancement, and that can be the most devastating and destructive. There are the ashes in which I realize that without God I'm nothing. But when I connect to God, I know that He energizes me, He gives me talents, He gives me ability, He gives me responsibilities. And I do that. That's wonderful. But then there are the ashes of paralysis, of despair, of passivity, of worthlessness. And then it becomes destructive. We talked last week about Cain and Hevel. So consequently, this is what the Torah is being merames. The ashes of humility have the greatest capacity to purify the impure. But if they are taken in the wrong direction, they contaminate you. They take away your initiative. They take away your self-confidence. They take away your belief in yourself that is indispensable to being an Eved Hashem. And therefore, humility is a double-edged sword. It is the greatest, most profound, deepest quality that a person must possess. But if taken in the wrong way, it itself becomes an agent of destruction and a cancer that wipes you out by taking away any sense that you have something to offer the world. If I truly think I'm nothing at all, then why do I get up in the morning? Why should I daven? Why should I learn? Why should I do mitzvot? Why should I do chesed? Who am I to do any of this? Again, this mirrors very much our discussion of Hevel last week in the context of the paradox. So, what we see now is we both understand, in part, obviously only in part, both why the ashes purify, because death comes into the world by hubris and gaiva, and we become liberated by obliteration of the ego, and that's why it purifies, and at the same time it contaminates and degrades and denigrates. So now we can understand how the ritual of Para Aduma is actually an atonement for the sin of the golden calf. Because let's go back to the sin of the golden calf. The sin of the golden calf, it's very, very interesting. It's very, very clear that the Jewish people did not believe this was the God that created heaven and earth. Rather, it's clear from the context of the Torah itself that they saw the Egel not as a substitute for God or an alternative God. They saw the Egel as a substitute for Moshe. Moshe was late. By the way, this is the old joke why Jewish weddings are always late. Because we know that the one time we insisted on punctuality, very bad things happened. Right, Moshe was supposed to come down the 40th day. He was late, or at least we thought he was late. We immediately panicked. We made a golden calf. So that was an eternal lesson. Don't stick to the clock too much, because sticking to the clock too much resulted in Mechedo Egel. Okay, that's an old Yiddish joke or excuse, so to speak, for why chasnas are late. But be it as it may, the Jewish people said, we must make for ourselves a God, a Elokim means a leader, because Moshe, the man who took us out of Mitzrayim, isn't here. And the Ramban explains, and the Kuzari explain, and we don't really understand the process, that they felt that Moshe was the intermediary that channeled the divine energy from God through the intermediary onto them. And they were not worthy or deserving of having their own relationship to God without a spiritual channeling intermediary. And if they couldn't have Moshe because they thought Moshe was dead, he was not coming back, they thought that the Egel could be a spiritual force that channels. So it turns out, actually, the Ramban writes, that the Chet HaEgel was not pure idolatry or paganism, but it was a failure to realize that each person must and can have a personal relationship with God without intermediary forces. So it turns out that the Chet HaEgel was not so much a rebellion against God, but a feeling of my inadequacy and my unworthiness to have a relationship with God. In other words, the midah of humility taken in a destructive, non-productive manner. Now, when you do tshuva on something, what does the Rambam say? You have to take the same characteristic that caused you to sin and utilize it for something positive. So the para aduma, which purifies me by obliterating my ego and then enabling me to serve Hashem by going into the temple, is taking the midah of humility, which was so destructive in the context of the Chet HaEgel, and now you're using it and you're dedicating it for a constructive purpose. That is what is called tshuva. True tshuva is when you take the very factor that led you astray and you can now use it for something positive. That's a higher level of tshuva than avoidance. One model of tshuva is, I had something that led me astray and I avoid it. And that is tshuva too. But the highest level of tshuva is the very negative becomes a positive. And that is the lesson of why para aduma is a kapara for the Chet HaEgel. One final thought, again, and this is not related to anything that I said until now. There is a medrash that is called a medrash pliyah. Pliyah just means an enigmatic medrash that doesn't seem to make any direct sense. And it says, if you want to understand para aduma, you must understand the sod, the secret meaning of Avat Yisrael. And if you understand the secret meaning of Avat Yisrael, you will understand para aduma. Well, it's hard to see. What does para aduma have to do with Avat Yisrael? So I think they say in the name of the great Hasidic Rabbi, the Apter Rav, who was known as the Ohev Yisrael, because that's the name of his Sefer, and he stressed Ohev Yisrael all the time, that this. What happens by para aduma? You're impure, you need to be purified. I, as a Kohen, purify you, but in the course of purifying you, I become impure. Now, for a Kohen to become impure is a bit of an inconvenience. He can't go to the Beis HaMikdash till he purifies himself. He can't eat truma. So what is the Kohen doing in a sense? The Kohen is basically saying, I'm willing to give up temporarily some of my status and some of my privileges to help another Jew. I'm willing to put myself out. I'm willing to suffer a little bit. So consequently, the Apter Rav says, this is quite ingenious, instead of looking at it as a paradox, the paradox is, how can it purify Ruvain if it contaminates Shimon? We actually look at it as a cause and effect. Because Shimon is willing to be contaminated, that elevates the act as a holy act of giving, and that is what effects the purity. In other words, it's mamash a cause and effect. If you're willing to give up some of yourself to help another person, that brings holiness, purity, and kedusha into the world. The willingness to give up something to help another person. By the way, just is it a double parsha this week? Chukas Balak. We didn't. No, it's not okay. So we're catching up. But the next parsha Balak, I'll tell you another. Since I mentioned the Oav Yisrael, let me give you a little advance on that. This is an amazing thing. The Apter Rav says every parsha in the Torah talks about Avat Yisrael. So somebody asked him, where in Balak does it talk about Avat Yisrael? Now, I don't understand the question. Ma Tovu Alecha Yaakov. I mean, there are explicit references to the greatness of the Jewish people, but okay. So the Apter Rav says, very pashut. I'll tell you exactly where it speaks about Avat Yisrael. The word Balak. Balak means the vase is v'ahavta, the lamed is lireyecha, and the kuf is kamocha. So Balak is abbreviation, v'ahavta lireyecha kamocha. So some of the students said, well, Rabbi, I with all due respect, v'ahavta is vav, and Balak is vase. Okay, lireyecha is lamed, kamocha is kaf, and Balak is kuf. I mean, it's not the same. Two of the three letters do not correspond to v'ahavta lireyecha kamocha. So the Apter Rav says, that's the point. When you love another Yid, you're not looking too closely at things. You're willing to look with a very, very generous eye. Once you start looking too closely, that shows that the Avat Yisrael is not truly there. So in truth, today is Rosh Chodesh, a good Chodesh, and we are approaching, of course, the 3 weeks, 17th of Tammuz. In 3 weeks, we will begin the 3 weeks. And this is the period where we mourn the destruction of the temple. And we know, of course, that the second temple was destroyed, even though the Jews were largely Torah observants. They kept mitzvos, they learned Torah. But sinat chinam is the reason that's given. The hatred, the polarization, and the like. So when we talk about trying to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, one of the most important things we have to be thinking about is how do we build Avat Yisrael in our own lives, within our own families. Again, we can't, like Rav Zosalanter said, when he was young, he wanted to change the world, and then he realized that's not going to work, and they could, his city, then his family. At the very end, he realized, I'll work on myself, and that's going to have a ripple effect. So, l'chol hapachot, I think all of us should be thinking about how in our own lives we can grow in our Avat Yisrael, and in that way, we are contributing towards the building of the Beis HaMikdash, and may it come b'mheira v'yameinu, and may this be a time of geula. So have a good night.
Shama shir shir chadyash